The zipper on her suitcase trembled under my fingers, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was the fabric shaking or my own hands. Sunlight slanted through the hallway window in thin, accusing lines, catching dust in the air like everything in my house was holding its breath. I remember thinking that packing her things should have felt like reclaiming my space, yet all I felt was a knot tightening in my chest. If you've ever had a moment where your own home stopped feeling safe, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than we realize. I didn't know it then, but that quiet morning, with folded clothes and rising dread, was the first crack in the life I thought I understood. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the weight of that first suitcase in my hands, the way the zipper trembled because my fingers wouldn't stop shaking. I wasn't packing for myself. I was packing for my daughter-in-law, stacking her clothes and shoes into neat little piles while trying to understand how my life had spun so far out of control. I kept telling myself I had every right to do it, that it was my house, my space, my sanity on the line. But underneath that certainty lived a quiet disbelief, the kind that whispers, "How did it come to this?" I had barely reached the doorway when I heard her voice rising from downstairs, sharp and frantic. Within moments, the sound shifted into something worse. An emergency call, my name spoken like I was a danger to myself, a threat, someone unwell. And as that realization hit, a cold ache crept up my spine. I knew she was twisting the situation, but I also knew how easily people believe a story when it's told with tears. By the time I stepped into the hallway, the house felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else entirely. My heart pounded as I tried to steady my breathing, but the wail of approaching sirens only made it harder. I remember thinking that it didn't matter what I said now. The moment those lights flooded my front yard, the world would see me the way she wanted them to. When the knock finally came, firm and unnervingly calm, I felt the floor shift beneath me. And that was the moment I realized this was only the beginning of something far larger than a family argument. Before everything unraveled, my life moved at a quiet, steady pace. After my husband passed, the house felt too large, but I learned to fill the silence with small rituals. Morning coffee on the porch, tending to the hydrangeas he planted, and calling my son Michael just to hear how he was doing. When he told me he and Brianna needed a place to stay while they got back on their feet, I welcomed them without hesitation. I thought it would bring life back into the house, maybe even heal pieces of me I didn't realize were still hurting. At first, it felt good having them there. I remember feeling proud watching Michael settle in, grateful that I could support him the way any mother hopes to. And Brianna seemed pleasant enough in those early days. She carried herself with confidence, always talking about new opportunities, new plans, new ways to improve their finances. I tried to match her optimism, even when her energy felt a little overwhelming for the quieter life I was used to. But over time, I started noticing small things that tugged at me, moments when she would brush off my help with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, times when she insisted on handling the mail or offered to organize my paperwork because it looked too stressful for me. I kept telling myself she meant well, that I was being sensitive, that adjusting to shared space always came with its bumps. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease that crept in whenever she hinted that I should let her take over certain decisions, financial ones, especially. She always framed it as concern, yet something about it felt rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for the moment to step in. Looking back, Those were the first tremors before the ground began to shift. The earliest signs that something in my own home was quietly slipping out of my hands. At first, the changes in my home were so slight that I almost convinced myself they weren't happening. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if a quiet tension had settled into the corners of each room. I kept brushing it off, telling myself that adjusting to new people in the house always took time. But those little shifts kept multiplying, and soon they were impossible to ignore. Brianna had a way of making me feel smaller without ever raising her voice. She would glance at something I did or didn't do, with the kind of smile that felt more like a judgment than a kindness. When I misplaced my keys or forgot a note on the counter, she acted as though it confirmed some private conclusion she had already drawn about me. I remember trying to laugh it off, pretending it was harmless, yet the uneasiness lingered. Then the financial oddities began appearing. A bill I knew I had paid resurfaced. A statement looked slightly altered. Mail went missing before I ever saw it. Each time I questioned it, I wondered if I was imagining things. That doubt was the part that frightened me most. For a moment, I actually wondered if I was growing forgetful, if grief or age were clouding my judgment. But the more I watched, the more I realized the pattern wasn't coming from me. It was circling around me. Brianna positioned herself between me and anything involving money, choices, or communication. She framed it as helping, yet every favor tightened her grip on my life a little more. By the time I recognized what was happening, the ground beneath me had already begun to tilt, setting the stage for the moment when those subtle manipulations would turn into something far more dangerous for me. The moment I decided to pack Brianna's belongings felt like crossing an invisible line I hadn't even realized I was standing on. I remember folding each piece of clothing with deliberate care, more for myself than for her, trying to reclaim the smallest sense of control in my own home. It was the first real boundary I had drawn in months, and for a brief moment, I felt steady again. But that steadiness didn't last. Brianna's reaction erupted like a storm I never saw coming. She painted my decision as something irrational, something dangerous, twisting it into a portrait of a woman slipping away from reality. Hearing her speak about me like that, even in fragments and tones, sent a cold shock through my chest. I felt myself drifting between confusion and disbelief, wondering how quickly a simple act could be turned into evidence against me. When the authorities arrived, the world around me seemed to narrow. Their calm expressions, the quiet assessment in their eyes, made it clear they were already leaning toward her narrative. I tried to steady my breath, to ground myself, but the air felt too thin. And then the supposed doctor stepped forward, a man I had never seen before, speaking as though he had been treating me for months. The surreal weight of that moment nearly buckled me. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a trap. I felt fear rise in a way I had never known, sharp and instinctive. How long had this been planned? How many steps had been taken without my knowledge? Just as panic began to tighten around me, I heard a familiar presence cut through the chaos. My attorney, Linda, arriving with a force of clarity I desperately needed. Her arrival didn't end the nightmare, but it did shift something inside me. For the first time, I saw a path through the fog, a way to uncover what was really happening and why. I sat in Linda's office feeling as though the world I knew had been peeled back, revealing something darker beneath it. The room was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying the fake doctor's calm confidence, the way he acted as if he owned the truth about my life. Linda laid out what she had uncovered, and with every new detail, the ground under me shifted a little more. The man who claimed to be treating me had no practice, no credentials, not even a valid license. What he did have was a trail, cases in nearby states where older adults had been labeled incompetent and funneled into guardianships that stripped them of everything. Hearing that was like having cold water poured down my back. Guardianship fraud. I had read about it in passing, never imagining I could be brushed up against something so calculated. The idea that someone could declare me unfit, take control of my decisions, my home, my money, it rattled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. And as Linda explained how these schemes operated, I began connecting dots I had ignored before. The missing mail, the altered statements, the carefully planted concerns about my memory. Even Brianna hovering over me during simple tasks suddenly felt like part of a script she had rehearsed. It was horrifying to realize how close I had come to losing everything without even understanding the danger. But beneath the fear, something else began rising. A stubborn, simmering resolve. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Linda walked me through the next steps, each one grounding me again. We documented everything, every irregular bill, every misplaced item, every strange interaction. She helped me install cameras around the house, small enough to go unnoticed but clear enough to capture what mattered. And together, we reached out to the authorities who specialized in these kinds of crimes. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself standing a little straighter. The confusion was giving way to clarity, and the fog that Brianna had tried to wrap around me was beginning to thin. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I could feel it pressing closer, especially the truth about who she really was before she ever stepped into my home. When Linda showed me what she had uncovered about Brianna's past, it felt as though the air itself tightened around me. I had expected something troubling, but nothing could have prepared me for the depth of what lay beneath the surface. There were records from other states, marriages I had never heard about, husbands whose lives ended under circumstances that seemed too convenient, too profitable for the woman who survived them. Each case left her financially stable, always just long enough for her to move on before questions grew too loud. I stared at the documents, struggling to make sense of how the same person who smiled across my kitchen table had walked through so many lives like a shadow. Shock moved through me like a slow burning flame, one that left behind equal parts grief and fury. I kept thinking back to moments I had brushed off, her eagerness to handle my bills, the way she hovered near my checkbook, her uncanny knowledge of my habits and routines. Suddenly, every one of those memories carried a new weight. The hardest part was remembering the look on my son Daniel's face when he learned the truth. He had defended her, believed in her, trusted her with his future. Watching that belief collapse in him was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. I could see him piecing together moments he had ignored too, realizing how carefully she had woven herself into our lives. But beneath all that heartbreak, something steadier began to rise inside me, a sense of purpose, a refusal to let her pattern continue. If she had done this before, and clearly she had, then others were in danger, and I was done being another step in her path. By the time I left Linda's office, the shock had settled into a hard, focused resolve. The truth was bigger than my home, bigger than my family. It was time to bring in the people who could expose the entire network behind her. And I knew the next step would take everything I had left: coordinating with federal agents to finally bring this entire operation into the light. I never imagined I would spend a morning preparing my own home for a federal sting operation. Yet there I was, moving through each room with an agent by my side, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle deep in my chest. The FBI had gone over every detail with me, where I would sit, how I should move, what signals they would watch for, even with their calm professionalism. I felt the tremor of fear running through me. I knew I was the bait, and the reality of that settled like a cold stone in my stomach. Still, underneath the fear was something steadier, the determination that had been growing ever since the truth began stitching itself together. By the time the agents positioned themselves outside, some in unmarked cars, others hidden near the porch, I felt the house shift into an entirely different version of itself. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow felt watchful. I sat where they told me to sit, my hands folded tightly in my lap, rehearsing the quiet composure I needed to hold when the advisor arrived. I reminded myself that he believed he still had control of the narrative, that he expected a frightened woman ready to be guided. The thought brought a brief, sharp spark of strength. When he finally stepped through my front door, the atmosphere thickened. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this countless times. I forced myself to remain calm, letting him believe I was alone, vulnerable, and ready to sign whatever he placed in front of me. Inside, though, every instinct was alert. I watched the way he scanned my living room, as if checking whether I had already crumbled under the pressure he had helped create. The agents had instructed me to let him talk, let him guide, let him reveal. And as he settled into his pitch, I felt myself detach just enough to observe him clearly, his practiced warmth, his gentle insistence that I needed help managing my affairs, his subtle push toward surrendering control. It was chilling to witness the performance now that I understood the truth behind it. The takedown happened so fast I barely had time to process it. One moment he was leaning forward, trying to pressure me into a signature, and the next the room exploded into motion. Agents flooded in from every direction, swift and commanding. He never had a chance to run. Watching him restrained should have brought relief, but instead I felt a hollow ache in my chest, an awareness of how close I had come to losing everything. The lead agent walked me through the aftermath, and that was when the second blow landed. This scam wasn't isolated. There were victims across multiple states, each one targeted through the same combination of false medical claims, fraudulent financial guidance, and forced guardianships. And at the center of it all was someone I had never expected. A licensed physician named Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a woman with real credentials and a long history of exploiting them. She had been orchestrating the entire network, using her authority to legitimize false diagnoses and funnel vulnerable people into the hands of advisors like the one just taken from my living room. Hearing that left me shaken. I felt grief for the people who hadn't escaped, and disbelief that someone with so much power had chosen to wield it this way. But as the agents continued outlining what came next, that grief began hardening into something resolute. I had survived the trap, and now, with the truth laid bare, I was ready to face whatever came after, ready to help uncover the full extent of what had been done, not just to me, but to so many others. And as the house slowly fell quiet again, I knew this was only the beginning of understanding the true cost of what had happened. In the hours after the arrests, my house felt strangely quiet, as if it were catching its breath right alongside me. I moved from room to room, noticing how different everything looked now that the danger had been pulled into the light. The fear was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer controlled the space. In the days that followed, the investigators kept me updated. They told me more victims had been located, people who had been trapped in the same web that had nearly taken my life apart. Some had lost their savings, others their homes, and hearing their stories filled me with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what they endured, gratitude that my case had helped bring the truth forward before it could claim even more lives. They also explained that a portion of the stolen money was already being recovered. Knowing that some of those victims would finally get something back felt like a small but meaningful piece of justice. As for me, my recovery came in quieter ways. I found myself relearning how to trust my own instincts, how to breathe without feeling watched, how to sit in my living room without bracing for something to go wrong. Daniel's remorse showed up gently, in the way he hovered near me during those first few days, trying to find words that matched the weight of everything he had overlooked. I didn't need a grand apology. I could see the truth in his eyes. We were both healing, just in different ways. Little by little, I reclaimed my home. I opened windows, let sunlight pour into corners that had felt dim for too long, and reminded myself that this place was mine again. And as that sense of peace returned, so did a quiet pride. I had stood up, spoken out, and played a part in stopping something far bigger than I realized. In that calm, I felt the beginning of understanding what this journey had truly meant and what I hoped others might take from it. Looking back on everything, I'm still amazed at how close I came to losing myself without even realizing it. But this journey taught me something powerful. Protecting your peace is not selfish. Trusting your instincts is not overreacting, and fighting for your own voice is never something to feel ashamed of. I'm grateful I found the strength to stand up when it mattered most, and I'm even more grateful for the people who helped me see the truth. Thank you for listening to my story and allowing me to share a piece of my life with you. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you, it's this: your safety, your boundaries, and your intuition deserve respect. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to reclaim your own voice? I'd truly like to hear it. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your experience in the comments.